There was a time, not very long ago, when the world moved at the speed of conversation, not at the speed of notifications. A time when silence wasn't something to escape from, but something you could rest inside. When evenings were slow, warm, and filled with the soft hum of everyday life. Before Wi-Fi, before smartphones, before screens followed us everywhere we went, families shared something far more powerful than instant messages. They shared their presence. If you close your eyes for just a moment, you can almost feel it again. The faint ticking of a wall clock in the living room. The sound of someone flipping through a newspaper. The clinking of dishes being dried and put away after dinner. The gentle drone of a television in another room, never too loud, because it didn't have to compete with dozens of digital distractions. Life felt calmer, fuller, more human. In those days, families didn't gather around glowing screens. They gathered around each other. Conversations weren't interrupted by buzzing phones or endless scrolling. When someone spoke, others listened. And when someone laughed, the whole room heard it. Not just an emoji on a screen. These were the moments that stitched people together, binding hearts in ways technology could never replicate. After dinner, many families would linger at the table, long after the meal was over. Kids would share stories from school, talking excitedly with their hands, sometimes exaggerating details just to make their siblings laugh. Parents would nod along, adding gentle advice or simply enjoying the sound of their children's voices. Time stretched in these moments. Nobody felt the urge to rush. Nobody checked the time unless it was to say, "It's getting late." But let's talk a little longer. On warm evenings, families might step outside and sit on the porch, watching the sky darken and the stars appear. Neighbors passed by during evening walks and stopped for conversations that could last anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour. You didn't need to schedule a video call, you just stepped outside. You didn't need to send a message, you just waved and said hello. The world was smaller, but somehow people felt closer. Inside the home, entertainment wasn't something you consumed alone. It was something you shared. A board game spread across the coffee table, its pieces worn from years of family battles. A deck of cards shuffled so many times the corners had softened. A puzzle in progress, one that took days, sometimes weeks, to finish. These activities weren't just ways to pass time. They were ways to build memories, to create stories that would be told and retold for decades. Even watching television was different. Families didn't sit together while each person stared at their own personal screen. There was only one TV in most homes, and everyone shared it. If a show came on at 8 p.m., you had to be there at 8 p.m., not streaming it later, not pausing it, not rewinding it. It made the experience feel special, almost ceremonial. You sat together, you watched together, and afterwards you talked about it together. And communication outside the home had its own magic. Phone calls came from rotary phones attached to the wall, and the ringing of the phone was an event. You didn't know who was calling until you picked up. You didn't screen your calls. You didn't ignore them. When the phone rang, someone answered because that's what people did. And when they answered, they were fully present, not half listening while scrolling through something else. Letters carried emotion in ways digital messages never could. You held them in your hands. You saw the handwriting, the imperfections, the crossed-out words. You felt the person in the ink, in the pressure of the pen. You saved those letters in drawers and shoeboxes, not because they were information, but because they were pieces of someone's heart. Children grew up learning patience. If they wanted to ask a friend something, they either called the house or waited until the next day at school. If they wanted to know something, they asked a parent, looked in a book, or figured it out through trial and error. The absence of instant answers created curiosity, imagination, resilience. Children had long stretches of uninterrupted time to explore, to play, to invent worlds in their minds. Families weren't perfect, of course, no era ever is, but they were connected in ways we rarely see today. When someone was sad, you noticed immediately, because you were looking into their eyes, not at a screen. When someone achieved something, you celebrated together around the dinner table. And when someone needed help, you showed up physically, not with a message that said, "I'm here if you need anything." People lived in the fullness of each moment, not in the constant anticipation of the next notification. Life had texture, breath, rhythm, and though the world had its share of challenges, families faced them together, truly together. Because back then, the closest connection wasn't wireless, it was human. Life before Wi-Fi and smartphones wasn't just different in the way we communicated, it was different in the way we felt the world. People lived more slowly, more intentionally, more openly. There was space between moments, and in that space, relationships had room to grow. People weren't constantly distracted, constantly pulled in 10 directions at once. Attention was a gift and people gave it freely. Sundays were a perfect example. They looked nothing like they do today. Work stopped, stores closed early or didn't open at all. The day had a softness to it, a kind of natural pause where families stayed home, spent time together, and recharged. Kids rode their bikes around the neighborhood, not because they were trying to get their steps in, but because it was fun, because it felt like freedom. Parents read the newspaper cover to cover. A neighbor might stop by unannounced, holding a plate of freshly baked cookies. The doorbell was never an inconvenience. It was a welcome surprise. Afternoons often carried the sound of radios playing softly in the kitchen or living room. Music flowed through the house with the smell of something warm cooking on the stove, a pot roast, a pie, homemade soup. Meals weren't rushed. There was no food delivered in minutes, no endless scrolling while eating. People sat at the table together. They made eye contact. They passed dishes by hand. They talked about their day, their hopes, their worries, and the conversations were real because there was nothing pulling them away. And when families did venture out, the world felt safer, not because it necessarily was, but because people trusted each other more. Kids played outside until the streetlights came on, racing down sidewalks, climbing trees, making up games that didn't need instructions or batteries. The simple act of being outdoors created friendships, real friendships, built on shared experiences, not shared digital likes. Parents didn't track their kids through apps. They tracked them through instinct, through trust, through the sound of laughter echoing from down the block. You knew your neighbors. You knew their kids. You knew their dog, their habits, their stories. The community was an extension of your home, and the world felt big enough to explore but small enough to feel connected. Inside the house, evenings were gentle. After dinner, the family might gather in the living room. Some nights the TV stayed off, replaced by a warm conversation or a quiet activity. A father repairing something at the kitchen table, a mother writing a letter or sewing a loose button. Children sprawled on the floor drawing pictures, building with blocks, or reading comic books. These were simple moments, but they were the backbone of family life. Small threads woven into memories that lasted a lifetime. When the television did come on, it wasn't mindless background noise. It was an event. Families picked a show to watch together. There was anticipation, excitement, a shared sense of discovery. And when the episode ended, everyone stayed for a moment, talking about their favorite scene or character, laughing about a joke, or predicting what might happen next week. Entertainment wasn't endless, and that limitation made it meaningful. The nights themselves felt different too. Bedrooms were quiet sanctuaries, not glowing with screens or buzzing with notifications. The only lights came from a bedside lamp, a nightlight in the hallway, or the moon shining through a curtain. People fell asleep to silence, real silence, or to the distant sounds of crickets, passing cars, or the gentle hum of the house settling. Sleep was deeper, softer, more peaceful. And perhaps one of the most beautiful parts of that time was the way people experienced boredom. Today, boredom is something to escape at all costs. But back then, boredom was the birthplace of creativity. It pushed kids to invent stories, build forts, play pretend, or dream up adventures with nothing more than imagination. Adults used boredom to think, to rest, to reflect. Moments of stillness weren't seen as wasted time. They were simply part of life. Technology didn't mediate every experience, every conversation, every emotion. When you liked someone, you told them in person. When you were upset, you talked about it face to face. When you missed someone, you wrote them a letter or made a phone call and hoped they were home. It created a kind of emotional courage that feels rare today. And in the background of all this, time moved more gently. Days felt long, not because they dragged, but because they were full. Full of tasks, full of connection, full of moments that were felt rather than captured. No one worried about documenting life for others to see. People simply lived it. If you grew up in that world, you probably remembered the feeling, the warmth, the simplicity, the closeness, the way conversations flowed without interruption, the way families stayed connected not through Wi-Fi but through shared routines, shared meals, shared hearts. It was a world built not on instant access but on meaningful presence. A world where people weren't constantly connected to everything because they were already deeply connected to each other. As the years passed and technology began to weave itself deeper into our lives, something subtle started to shift. It wasn't sudden. It didn't happen in a single moment. It happened quietly. The way sunlight fades into dusk so slowly that you hardly notice it until the world looks different. And before we knew it, the endless hum of digital life replaced the gentle rhythm of the world we once knew. When the first home computers arrived, they felt like small miracles, glowing with possibilities but still separate from daily life. Families shared a single screen, just like they once shared a single telephone. But then the internet came, and with it came the first ripples of change. At first, it was magical. The sound of dial-up, the anticipation while waiting for a page to load, the thrill of sending your very first email. It felt like the world was expanding in front of us. But even then, the connection was slow, clumsy, temporary. You logged on, explored a little, logged off, and then went back to your life. Life still felt human, but when Wi-Fi arrived, everything changed. Suddenly, the internet wasn't a place you visited, it became a place you lived. The world became faster, louder, more demanding. Notifications replaced doorbells. Text messages replaced phone calls. And screens became windows into every corner of the world, except the one right in front of us. Smartphones were the final step, the point of no return. They promised convenience, connection, entertainment, knowledge, and in many ways, they delivered. But they also fractured something quiet and precious: presence. Before smartphones, families spoke to each other with full attention. They looked into each other's eyes, they listened, they shared stories uninterrupted. Arguments happened face to face, and so did forgiveness. Today, conversations are often broken into fragments, interrupted by buzzing, blinking, vibrating devices demanding attention like restless children. Before smartphones, waiting wasn't a burden, it was a moment of stillness, a time to think, a time to breathe. Now every quiet moment feels like an empty space we rush to fill with scrolling, tapping, checking anything to avoid silence. Before smartphones, boredom sparked creativity. Kids drew pictures, built worlds out of imagination, explored nature, invented games with nothing but their surroundings. Today, boredom is something instantly eliminated, replaced by endless videos, endless feeds, endless stimulation that leaves us strangely empty. Before smartphones, friendships were formed in real life, through shared experiences, shared laughter, shared struggles. A friend wasn't a profile, it was a person. Someone whose voice you knew, whose expressions you recognized, whose presence brought comfort. Now many friendships live inside screens, real, yes, but thinner somehow, lacking the warmth of a handshake, the joy of a shared meal, the memory of walking side by side in the same physical world. Before smartphones, time felt abundant. Long evenings, slow weekends, quiet mornings. The days didn't feel shorter because they weren't constantly divided into notifications and scrolling. Life had a rhythm, a beginning, middle, and end. Now, time slips away without shape, lost in the blur of constant digital motion. Before smartphones, privacy was natural. Personal moments stayed personal. People lived without an audience. Life didn't need to be documented to feel real. We didn't measure experiences by likes or approval. We measured them by how they felt, by the laughter in the room, by the warmth in our hearts, by the memories that stayed with us long after the moment passed. Sometimes people say the world was simpler back then, but that's not quite true. Life was still full of challenges, worries, work, responsibilities. What was different wasn't the world, it was the pace, the expectations, the attention, the closeness. Because when you remove the noise, the constant connection, the digital clutter, something beautiful emerges. People, conversations, feelings, presence, the things that matter most. And even today, when we step away from the screens, when we put the phones down, when we sit together without digital interruptions, that old feeling returns. The feeling of being truly connected, the feeling of being human again. There's a reason so many people look back with nostalgia. It's not because they miss the inconvenience of the past. It's because they miss the closeness, the kind that doesn't need Wi-Fi or passwords or notifications. They miss the sound of voices around the dinner table. They miss eye contact. They missed long conversations that didn't have an expiration point. They miss being present, really present with the people they loved. And deep down, I think we all feel it. A quiet longing for a world where hearts stayed closer, because distractions stayed farther away. The world before Wi-Fi and smartphones wasn't perfect, no time ever is, but it was a world where connection meant something deeper, something fuller, something real. And the truth is that world isn't lost. It's still there, waiting for us, just beneath the surface of our modern lives. All we have to do, is remember it. Looking back now, it's almost unbelievable how much the world has changed in such a short amount of time. We carry entire universes in our pockets, endless information, limitless entertainment, constant connection. The modern world is faster, brighter, louder, more efficient. But sometimes, when the noise fades for just a moment, we can still feel the echo of the world we left behind. A world where presence meant everything, where conversations were long and unbroken, where love didn't need to be typed out, it was felt in the room. And when we think about it, the difference isn't measured in technology, but in attention. Because attention is the purest form of closeness. To look someone in the eyes and truly see them, to listen without distraction, to exist in the same moment, fully, completely, without the pull of a screen or the tug of a notification. That was the foundation of connection. That was the heartbeat of family. In the world before Wi-Fi and smartphones, families built closeness on simple rituals that now feel almost sacred. Evening walks, dinner tables filled with laughter, lazy Sunday afternoons, games that lasted for hours, handwritten notes, long drives with nothing but the radio and the sound of quiet company. These weren't moments we tried to capture, they were moments we lived deeply and without thinking about their value. Because back then, we didn't measure memories, we made them. And maybe that's why they remain so vivid in our hearts, because we were truly in them. The memory of a parent's voice calling you home at dusk, of siblings arguing over the last cookie and then laughing about it moments later, of grandparents telling stories you've heard 100 times, but listening anyway because their voices felt like home. These memories stay not because they were photographed, but because they were felt. Today, we live in a world overflowing with connection, but starving for closeness. We communicate constantly, but often without depth. We share everything but reveal very little. We have more ways than ever to reach each other and yet, somehow, fewer ways to truly connect. And that's why the memory of life before smartphones resonates so deeply. It wasn't a perfect world, but it was a connected one, connected in the ways that matter most. But here's the truth we often forget. We can have that closeness again. Connection didn't disappear. Attention did. Presence did. But presence is something we can choose at any moment on any day. We can put the phone down during dinner. We can talk without checking notifications. We can listen without distraction. We can sit with the people we love and let silence be comfortable again. We can bring back the small rituals that once made life feel full. We can look up instead of looking down. In many ways, the world before Wi-Fi wasn't lost. It's waiting. It lives inside each of us, in the memories that formed us, in the values that shaped our families, in the quiet corners of our hearts that still ache for slowness, for simplicity, for closeness. Because what truly kept families connected back then wasn't the lack of technology. It was the abundance of presence. It was the willingness to be there fully, honestly, openly. And even today, surrounded by screens and signals, that kind of connection is still possible. All it takes is intention. All it takes is one moment, a moment where we choose each other over the noise. So when we think of the world before Wi-Fi and smartphones, we're not just remembering an era. We're remembering a feeling of closeness, of warmth, of being seen and heard without distraction, a feeling of belonging, the kind that no technology can replace. And perhaps, in remembering, we learn something important, that the greatest connection we will ever have is not digital, it's human, and it's still right here.